So I am here to talk to you about Angular. Oh man, that washes it out.
Brother, you're leaning on the light switch right there. Too much.
I like it romantic. All right, so I have some.
A little more light?
Oh, yeah. A little more light?
It's the second one.
All right.
Sure.
Well, now it's less romantic, but probably more efficient. All right, so I have a lot of slides to get through, so hopefully I can get through all the slides and then we can have time for questions. If not, I'll be here all night signing autographs. I don't have cool t-shirts, sorry. I mean, I do have one on, but not to give out. All right, cool. So my name's Ari. I live in San Francisco. I was on a plane a few hours ago, and then I'll be on a plane in a few hours from now. I'm going to talk to you today about AngularJS. So real quick, why you should listen to me, who I am. I started a company called Full Stack in San Francisco. I wrote a book on Angular. It's about 600 pages, and it's constantly being updated. It's the only constantly updated book on AngularJS, so we have a big release for 1.3 coming out. I also run NG Newsletter. I wrote a bunch of other little books specifically on Angular, and I teach professionally. In fact, that's why I'm getting on a plane tomorrow, because I'm teaching. All right, awesome. So let's get started. HTML is old. It's old. It's old. Let's face it. It's older than some of us in this room. Not older than me. I'm old. All right, so this is HTML. If you guys are at JSLA, presumably you've seen HTML before. This is HTML if you haven't seen it. HTML is static. It's the skeleton. It's the content of our application. It's not a web app. It was not built to have interactive websites, and credit to Mozilla and all the people who built HTML itself and what we know as HTML today. It wasn't, browsers back then were not really capable of us being able to build rich interactive experiences with HTML. So how do we add interaction today? We use something called JavaScript. It's the language that won out. And yes. Anyway, so if you weren't using any framework, you'd use straight JavaScript. JavaScript looks a little bit like this, where you grab the element and you apply some interaction on top of that element, and then you do things with that and let the user play around and click and update things and all that fun stuff. Or if you're really badass, and pretty much everyone here is, use something like jQuery. And jQuery is a imperative wrapper around the DOM. And it also, one of the nice things about jQuery is that it also it makes the interaction with every single browser the same. So you don't have to worry about how that works underneath the wrapper or underneath the hood. You just have to deal with the wrapper. jQuery is not a web application maker. It allows us low-level access to edit and augment the DOM. So what's wrong with using something like jQuery, where you have your JavaScript files and your HTML files, and they're totally separate from each other? Well, you get things like tight coupling. You have two completely different languages where you're editing in one file and you're editing in a different language or a different markup language than you're editing in another file. You get this tight coupling. So what happens if a designer comes along and changes that H1 to an H2? And then you're depending on that, the interaction is depending on that being an H2 tag. If you're here at JSLA, I promise you've run into that issue. Like, why is the button not working anymore? Oh my goodness. It's that tight coupling that you're running up against. It also doesn't enforce a really good code structure. You have to enforce that for yourself. And then lastly, I previously mentioned this, you have this really low-level interaction with DOM elements that are on the page. So how should we do it then? What if we could reinvent HTML as we know it is today? That's where AngularJS plays. So AngularJS is a MVW framework, because the W stands for whatever. We should use Angular itself is super fast for development. It's also super fast in production if you do things right. Even if you do things wrong, it's super fast in production. It's just fast. You take off that blue, and then it's just fast. It's sponsored by Google. It's used at hundreds of projects inside of Google, and it's also used in projects outside of Google, and it's also used all over the internet. For instance, sites like Live Lovely, which is an awesome site, or Kangaroom, or this one, which I just found today. It's a mobile app, obviously, or made by Source, who are also awesome. It's super cost efficient for development and production applications. What I mean by that is it's super fast to make Angular applications, and it's super fast to make impressive Angular applications. And it's built from the start with testing in mind. We are front-end developers. Well, now I'm a front-end developer. I used to be a back-end developer. We're front-end developers. We're not used to testing, but there are such great tools now available for us to use to test our front-end applications. If you're not testing, you should be embarrassed. If you're not testing in a year from now, you're probably out of a job. All right. Sorry, I'm a test bigot. So, and it also has a highly active community, and there are many open source components. So anything that you're doing in jQuery or you're doing in another framework that you're using to be unnamed, you can do it in Angular. And if you don't know how to do it yourself, there's probably someone else has already done it. And if someone else hasn't done it, it's pretty easy to do. And I know a book that can help you figure out how to do it if you need. And it's totally free. You don't have to pay for it. And you can just use your standard text editor, so you don't have to pay for a text editor or an IDE. So let's look at some code. This is static HTML. This looks like this in code. It's pretty short. If we look at this, we have a couple different things inside of our code. We have these things called elements. These elements, we have inside of that code, we have an H1 element and we have a button element. You can think of these from the browser's perspective as function calls. When the browser sees one of these, it executes that function call and places that on the page. Each one of these, the way that we write HTML today, each one of these tags can take elements or attributes. There's a bunch of different attributes that are available in DOM elements, such as that. I like to think of those attributes as arguments to those functions, named arguments to those functions. Right. So with that in mind, let's look at our first Angular application. This is the canonical Angular application. If you've gone to AngularJS.org, you've seen this application. This is standard HTML. If you're here at JSLA, so you've seen that before. We've only done 4 things inside of this HTML that make it different, that make it an Angular application. I'll point those out right now. I lied. I'll point that out after this slide. This is the Angular application. Hooray. Whoops. Hooray, that's the Angular application. It updated real time. Awesome. Okay. So the 4 things that we did were we added this, it's called a directive. It looks like an attribute in this case. We added the ngapp directive to the body, to a body tag. We've added another directive to the input element called ngModel right there. And then we included the Angular source. And that is it. Wow. I built a live interactive demo in those 4 lines of code. Okay. So let's build an Angular app. The way that we define an Angular app is we don't actually write an Angular application. We don't say like angular.app. We say angular.module because Angular is very modular. It was written to be modular. So what we do is we write modules, and then we apply those modules to the page. This is how you create an Angular application. You use the first one of these. The first one of these is called a setter. That's how you create the application. And then the second one's obviously a getter. It says it right there. That's how you fetch the application that you've already created. And the way that you apply that to the page, the way that you call that on the page is you use that ngApp directive, and you put that ngApp directive somewhere on your page, and that tells Angular to start up your Angular application. All right. So when I was typing things inside of that input field, I was live updating a data bind between my Angular application and the front end. That's called data binding. The way that we use data binding, that's called data binding. The way that we get a hold of our data in our data binding is by using the scope. If you've ever looked at Angular, you've probably seen this. If you haven't looked at Angular, you'll see this right now. Okay. A scope is simply a plain old JavaScript object. What that means is that we can do anything on that scope object. We can do the same way that we work with any other JavaScript object. Here at JSLA, you've used JavaScript objects before, so anything that you've done in the past, you can still do on the scope. How do we get access to the scope? How do we manipulate the scope? We use something called a controller. The scope is the controller's model object. It's how we interact with the page. This is what a controller looks like. Notice that I'm calling the controller function on our Angular module that we defined right there. And in this case, I'm only setting a single variable called name, and that name includes a value called Ari, which happens to be my name, and that gives the HTML DOM element underneath it, all its children. It gives access to that variable called name. So you can see here when we apply that to the page, we have an h1 tag that will resolve to whatever is inside that name. In this case, it's Ari because that's my name. Right. We can also add functions to scopes. Like I said, it's just a plain old JavaScript object. So if we wanted to add interaction to an element, we can do something like this, where we create the say hello function, and we would apply that to the page using a directive that we'll talk about shortly called ngClick. So when it does exactly what you think it does. When you click on that element, that thing runs, whatever's inside that. In this case, oh, I took the demo out. That's unfortunate. Okay. In this case, if there was a demo in here, you click on the button and then an alert would pop up because I clicked on the button and it ran that function. Cool. So the astute observer might say, okay, that's cool. So this is how I define a function. But what is this scope thing, and how did it get inside of there? That is called dependency injection, and we will talk about that shortly. Oh, there it is. Hooray, I clicked on the button and the alert popped up. All right, so views. Remember, we're talking about an MVW framework, so we can't leave off the V of the MVW framework. Views. Views are simply just HTML. This is simply HTML. It includes things. It includes directives and these squiggly bracket things. Those are bindings. It includes those things, and we'll talk about that shortly. I'm sorry, but that's just HTML. Haha. Great. So what the F is a directive? A directive is simply a function that is run on an element that augments its abilities, augments whatever that element is doing. So this is what a lot of people seem to get stuck on when they hear the word directive. A directive is simply a function. It's just a function. A directive is a function. It's just a function. Okay. We've seen a couple directives before. In this example, we have the ngController directive, where we're attaching a controller to the page. We have this ngClick directive that augments that button element with an onClick event, and that onClick event calls that expression. And we also have this ngModel, and then, believe it or not, this squiggly bracket thing is also a directive, represents a directive-ish. Cool. So as I kind of mentioned before, we can think of directives as functions. We can think of HTML as functions, and directives are simply functions. So it's as though we are calling functions in our HTML, just like this. Angular comes with a lot of built-in directives. We have that ngController directive that simply applies the controller element to the element and all its children. It gives control to that controller. For instance, in this case, we have two controllers. Here, each one of these has a different name associated with it. Excuse me. They're sitting next to each other, so neither one of them has access to the global name, but they have access to their local name. You can see in this case, one of these is Ari, and one of these is Steve, although I kind of want to make this David. Cool. We have the ngClick directive. ngClick directive does exactly what you think it does, adds an onClick event. We kind of mentioned that before. You can see that we have a button that is asking us to click on it, so we'll click on it. It's incrementing that count. We have this ngRepeat directive. The ngRepeat directive takes a copy of whatever DOM element it's on now and copies it as many times as it can over an iterable object, that either objects or arrays. So in this case, let's say that we want to show a list of all of our emails in my company, and all the people in my company are right here. Then you can see using ngRepeat, we would create us a table like this. Super fast, super easy. We also have ngShow and ngHide, which do exactly what you would expect ngShow and ngHide to do. It shows or hides it based on a condition in your application. You can see in this demo we have an h1 tag that shows if we have a Boolean that says it should show, and then we have the h2 tag doing the inverse of that. So you can see if we click on this h1, the h2 shows up. If we click on the h2, the h1 shows up. We can dance like this all night. Okay. There are many, 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 many more built-in directives. There's also tons of community directives available. In fact, I wrote a couple. And then there's also a bunch of custom directives, and then there's the ability for us to create our own custom directives, which is how the community can create directives. So let's get back to this thing about scope. Like, what is that scope thing inside of the controller? Or more appropriately asked, how does the controller get access to that scope? Well, that is through something called dependency injection. You guys are all here at JSLA, which presumably means you know what dependencies are. Dependencies, if you don't know what they are things that you need to run something, right? We all have used dependencies in the past, unless, of course, you write assembly language, in which case you're probably re-implementing printf, which means you are really hardcore. Dependencies are simply just ways to run things, or dependencies are like libraries that we use to do other things that we write. That was a terrible description of dependency.
Outsource.
Right, we outsource the functionality to someone else. So when we defined our controller, what we were doing is we were saying, hey, controller, we want to interact with this scope object. So there's a couple ways that we can get access to that. Either we can provide like a global way for our controller to look up where that scope object is for that controller, which is a really pain in the butt way to do things. Or we can say when that controller is instantiated, here's the thing you get to work with. Here's the instantiator who's responsible for creating the controller can hand it to the controller, which is much easier, which is how we can do things like this. So in this case, we're telling Angular that we want the demo controller's scope injected into that constructor function. So we don't have to do anything other than put that $scope inside of there. We can inject all our dependencies like this. There's a bunch of services inside of Angular. We're not going to be able to cover services today, but if you were using the queue service or the HTTP service, you can see that we can simply inject those the same way. If you're interested in knowing how that actually works under the hood, Angular is doing fake annotations. I have a big, long post on it on ng-newsletter.com, or a book. Cool. So, right. So our applications are only as interesting as the data that we expose through our applications, right? So, for instance, this is actually not where that's supposed to go. This slide was supposed to come first. Right, so data is our web applications are only as interesting as the data that is populated in them and the way that we manipulate them and show them on the screen for our user. So we want to get access. We want a way for us to get access to this other data and use data from around the web. We can, going back to 2 slides, this is how you do something like, this is how you do it inside of jQuery. You pass in a callback, and then you do things with that callback and all that fun stuff. For instance, here in LA, the weather forecast for right now is we have a high of 63 and a low of 46. This room feels like 46 for sure. And you guys have a really clear sky. In San Francisco, it's not clear. It's rainy and foggy. Okay, so the way that we get access to data around the web is we can use the $HTTP service, which is provided by Angular. That comes from Angular by default. And it's really just a wrapper around the low-level XML HTTP request object. We can make all sorts of requests using this object. And by virtue of the fact that we are making a request out to the web, out somewhere else to another site, we want this to be asynchronous. And it is asynchronous. We don't want our application waiting for a response to come back before it shows to the user. Otherwise, Facebook would really suck to use if it was just blocked all the time. So there's a couple different ways that we can interact. We can handle asynchronous function calls, callbacks, as I previously as we previously showed. Callbacks are one way to do this, where you write a function, you pass the function descriptor to the function that's calling it, that's going to end up calling that callback. And then whenever that function gets run, you know that that function, you know that the asynchronous call has come back to you. That's one way to handle it. The problem is then you get into this thing which you guys here at JSLA know all about, which is callback hell. Callback hell refers to when you have a giant pyramid of callbacks because you're just calling a callback after a callback. If you want to interact with data, let's say you need to make 2 HTTP requests because first you're getting a user's name and then you're going to go get their friends. That's 2 HTTP calls. Then you get a nice little callback pyramid. What happens if an error happens inside there? How do you handle that? Great, so you pass in a second callback, but does that second callback get called if the first function doesn't get an error but the second one does? How do you deal with that? Callbacks are fun to work with. There's another way to do it, and that's by using something called a promise. And a promise is fairly simple. A promise is fairly simple. It's simply wow, these slides are out of order. A promise. Wow, they are all out of order. Great. A promise is simply an object that it will run the success function on that object, so you can get that object back, and then you define a function to run after you get that object. It also defines if there's an error, you can define an error function on that object and handle that if there's an error. This is, by the way, the function that we had running there to get the weather. Okay, there we go. Right. So promises are built into Angular. Angular itself, everything inside of Angular works on, not everything inside of Angular. Angular is super powerful because it uses promises. So you turn something like what we previously had here, which is the get function passing in 2 callbacks, into something like this, which is much easier to read and much easier to handle errors inside of. I mentioned at the top that Angular is built for testing. It's awesome. I highly recommend, if you've never tested, even if you're not doing it for work because your work is 10 years behind. I'm just kidding, 2 years. Right. Testing is awesome. The end-to-end testing framework inside of Angular is super awesome. Protractor, I have a long blog post on it on ng-newsletter.com. There's about 90 pages worth of the book is dedicated to that. It's built off Jasmine, although you can use other testing frameworks if you want to. Like I mentioned, the end-to-end testing is awesome. It's really fun to see your browser open up automatically. Basically, end-to-end testing, if you don't know what I'm talking about, is instead of opening up the page and typing in things and moving your mouse around and clicking on things, you can do that all in code, and you can get your computer to execute that for you as though it were a human. That's what end-to-end testing is. And it's really fun to see your browser opening up automatically. You just sit back and watch. Okay. Right. If you haven't written in Jasmine, Jasmine's really nice. You get these nice describe blocks that give you context where you're setting up your tests. And then this is end-to-end testing where you can navigate and click on things and set up expectations that your view looks like the way that it should. Great. So this is the cover of the book that I wrote. It's, like I said, it's 600 pages. It's constantly being updated. We have a 1.3 release coming out soon. Angular 1.3 itself is not released yet. It will be soon. So also, if you want it, it's on ngbook.com. Right. And there was supposed to be a code in here. So the code, if you want to get the book, by virtue of the fact that you are here and you are listening to me speak, there's a coupon code for both packages of the book, and it's the same coupon code called JSLA. Grab it. It's good. Thanks. Any questions? JSLA. Just one word.
Lowercase?
Right. It's all lowercase. It's all, no dot. I don't think the browser generally... Yeah, there's a backslash and an ampersand. Make sure you HTML encode it. Cool. So, any questions? Do I have time for questions?
Yeah.
Cool. Any questions?
So have you heard what the new upgrade's going to be for 1.3?
Yes, it's already in the book.
For those of us who don't have the book right now?
I mean, so 1.3 drops. What's that? Oh, I will repeat the question. The question was, what are the upgrades in 1.3? 1.3 itself, the biggest update to 1.3 is they're dropping official support for IE8. Hooray! Angular was written for the web as it is going to be, not as I mentioned, we're reinventing HTML. So Angular's now focused on the future, not on the past. The book itself does cover how to get Angular to work on IE8, but it will only work on 1.2 and beyond, because I have no interest in updating and keeping IE8 up to date in the book.
Or you should.
And I won't. Yes.
I haven't used Angular in about a year. So I was curious, like in the last year, like what are the really big things that are new in Angular?
The question was, you haven't used, or I guess the statement that preceded the question was, you haven't used Angular in a year. And the question was, what are the really big updates? What version were you on?
I don't know. They just changed the name to Testacular to Karma. So that's how.
Well, they just changed the name from Testacular to Karma, because Testacular is. I've tripped over that word so many times. Me too. A lot. A lot. I'll leave it at that. Any more questions? Yes. Yes, with the hair.
Which one?
The guy with the hair. I'm just kidding. Yeah. Someone asked me a question.
Performance on mobile?
I'm glad you asked that. I totally forgot to mention this. Full Stack itself is launching this new this site. We do a lot of teaching professionally, and we're launching this site to kind of wrap in a lot of these teachings in a at-home feature to do it at your own leisure. You don't have to come, and we don't have to come, and we can all do it in our pajamas or naked if you want. The reason why I bring this up is because we are launching this next week, and in about 3 to 4 weeks, we will have a mobile video that details all like how to use Angular to build mobile apps and build super fast mobile apps. Performance on Angular as it stands right now, it's good. You just have to be delicate about what you're doing. Hopefully that helps.
Like bull in a china shop delicate? Like, what is that?
Angular is really performant itself. The trouble is when you get things called watches, when you get a lot of watches, or you get a lot of things that have to happen inside the digest loop. When you get a lot of things and a lot of complex things running inside that digest loop, it slows down. So there's ways that you can optimize, and you can reduce that type of thing. You can not use the digest loop when you need to. You can stay out of that type of stuff. Yes.
What made you switch from back end to front end?
What made me? Let's talk after.
Okay.
Okay.
What don't you want recorded?
Well, it's more of a story, which is, and then plus I'm so hot right now. I just got to take some things off to answer that. Yes.
Somewhat off topic, how do you feel about web components?
I think it's awesome. How do I feel about web components? I think they're awesome. I have time for one more question. Yes.
It looked like when you serve up an app, it has all the curly braces in it with the directives in them. But that kind of sucks for SEO if a web crawler hits your page and you give them HTML with lots of curly brackets. Does Angular deal with that?
Okay, so the question was, how does Angular deal with SEO? Right?
Yeah.
Well, I've given this answer 3 times already, so I'll just repeat it again. I know a book that can help you out with that. And there's a big long post on ngnewsletter.com, ng-newsletter.com. Actually, ngnewsletter.com. By the way, real quick, because I'm really proud of it, this is all done. This is not an image. This is all done in CSS. All right. Cool. And I'll be around if you have more questions later and stuff.
All right.
Give it up for Ari. That was awesome.